In the history of my light body, it will show I could have been another.
Welcome to the Poetry Magazine podcast. I'm guest editor Sue Cho. This week, I'm so excited to bring you a conversation with Gabrielle Cavalcaresi. We'll hear some of their Miss You poems, which for me exist as a kind of enchantment, a way to make actual space for the dead to inhabit. We'll also hear a poem Gabrielle was a little nervous to read, but read anyway, and how lucky we are they did. And food. I never expected to meet a poet who loves food as much as I do. This conversation holds a lot of pain and a lot of joy. And so without further ado, here's Gabrielle Cavalcaresi, or as their friends say, Gabby.
I like to build a poem that's a kind of vessel that anyone can drop into, that doesn't feel abstract. I think it maybe has something to do with growing up both with a family that owned movie theaters, and so like sitting in this deep lyric experience of the movie, and also being someone who lives between genders and sometimes does not even feel they have a kind of gender. And so always wanting to make a space of welcome that also feels like specific and not like some kind of cop-out. And so this poem, which was the first of the misuse that I wrote, I'm writing all these poems that sort of use that phrase over and over again. It came during COVID when I was thinking about all kinds of other deaths, of course, like the rest of us, and death was everywhere. But it also, like, in that space, I don't know if you had this experience, like COVID just brought all the ghosts back. It just brought everyone who had died kind of to the house, to the space of my being. And then the question is like, well, do you let them in or not? And it's like, I should probably at this point in the podcast just do a little trigger warning and say that it's very likely that we will talk about suicidal ideation and suicide. And so I just want to like take a deep breath with that for the listeners. And like, you know, if that doesn't suit you, it's been so wonderful even spending this amount of time with you. I really appreciate you. When I was younger, when my mom took her life, I didn't sleep for like 4 months because I was so scared her ghost would come. As I've gotten older, and particularly I live in an old house now, and the idea of ghosts coming and kind of like, you know, good and generative haunting is something that really matters to me, and that COVID has in so many ways opened a kind of gate where it's just like, oh gosh, like there's so many losses that I wish I could just bring something back. Miss you. Would like to take a walk with you. Do not care if you just arrive in your skeleton. Would love to take a walk with you. Miss you. Would love to make you shrimp saganaki like you used to make me when you were alive. Love to feed you, sit over steaming bowls of pilaf, little roasted tomatoes covered in pepper and nutmeg. Miss you. Would love to walk to the post office with you. Bring the ghost dog. We'll walk past the waterfall and you can tell me about the after. Wish you could come back for a while. Don't even need to bring your skin sack. I'll know you. I know you will know me even though I'm bigger now, grayer. I'll show you my garden. I'd like to hop in the leaf pile you raked, but if you want to jump in, I'll rake it for you. Miss you. Standing, looking out at the river with your rake in your hand. Miss you in your puffy blue jacket. They're hip now. I can bring you a new one if you'll only come by. No, I told you it was okay to go. No, I told you it was okay to leave me. Why'd you believe me? You always believed me. Wish you would come back so we could talk about truth. Miss you. Wish you would walk through my door. Stare out from the mirror. Come through the pipes.
It's so intense. This poem has a way of like reanimating memory to the point I feel like the person is here, that you have summoned them to your side. I laugh whenever I am about to share something personal. I can't, it's like a little tick of mine. But
Yeah.
I didn't realize I always thought about dying or like picturing myself dying because whenever, this is why I have a hard time going on vacation or going somewhere new. I love to go somewhere I'm comfortable and have been many times because anytime I go somewhere different, I just imagine all the ways I could die accidentally or on purpose. If I go with people I love, I think about us dying. I don't know. I can't have fun. So I like to go to a place and then go again with the same group of people. And they're like, you must love like Door County in Wisconsin. I'm like, no, I just have now gotten over me picturing our deaths. Like, no biggie.
Isn't it amazing though? It's like I've gone to this place, I have survived.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I wonder, maybe this is a strange question, but can you talk more about your relationship or your ideas about ghosts and your poetics?
Sure.
And this kind of embodiment?
Yeah, I mean, I think ghosts are kind of everywhere in my work. And I think my work has gotten more interesting. Ethical is a weird word, but maybe more ethical as I have moved. Like, I think I began using persona in poems in my first book because, well, it was hard for me to figure out how to talk about my mother's death and various kinds of things like in a new and interesting way. And that was a way of getting at it. But it was also a way of me not thinking about all the voices that kind of just haunt me all the time and getting more comfortable with just like the idea of being haunted and allowing death to be present in all kinds of ways that aren't necessarily romantic and but are also like sometimes pretty friendly. I think it's not surprising that my poems have begun to talk a lot more about things like suicidal ideation as I become more comfortable with this idea of death and with the idea of like the deep, deep pleasure of staying alive when one knows that that is like, that doesn't have to be so, if that makes sense. And I think that for many of us who have lost someone to suicide, that is a kind of gate that opens and you see certain possibilities. And for a long time, I was really scared to talk about that, either in real life or in poems. And then I got a lot of really good therapy. I had a total nervous breakdown in 2004. And I became more comfortable in my life and in my poetics, thinking about and talking about death more openly, which I think is one of the things that's really like kept me alive in a certain kind of way, because I think I had kept certain doors locked so tightly and I was so ashamed to think about ghosts, haunting, death, how that affected me, that I couldn't really breathe anymore. And yeah, so I think that there are a lot of joyful ghosts and sorrowful ghosts in the work now. And there's also the constant ghost of the body that I'm always imagining for myself that doesn't quite exist, that is also this spirit that just kind of moves around the room of my life and my poems.
I really like how you said you're getting more comfortable thinking about death and writing about it and talking about it, because I love how you frame it as a process and that it's always something you get more comfortable with. But I don't know, what does it mean to be fully comfortable with it?
Yeah, and more and less comfortable. And also, I mean, I do want to certainly pause right now and say, like, if you're in trouble right now and you need help and you need to call someone, you should absolutely call someone. And there have been lots of times in my life where I've needed to call someone and need to get some help. So, you know, there are all kinds of levels of this, but maybe in a way getting comfortable with it for me is having a healthy like fear of dying. It is not something that I want to do. And also understanding that there are times when it's hard for me to be alive, and that's okay. And what I just need to do is figure out, okay, well then what's the world I build around myself that helps me keep going? In a weird way, that's like being in touch with my own ghost, who I'm not ready to meet yet or to become.
Yeah. It's fascinating hearing you talk about this because in your Miss You poems, there's such a confidence in this presence. And there's such a conversational tone, like the way you read it. It's like you're just listing things off while you're just, walking around the house. And there's such a delight to food and abundance, right? Despite death, ghosts, etc. So I was wondering if you could read your second Miss You poem. Miss You would like to grab that chilled tofu we love.
Sure. Oh, I'd love to. And this is for my dear friend, the Indigenous scholar and just all around remarkable person, Jenny Tonpahot, who passed away in 2019. And everyone should go find her work. Miss you. Would like to grab that chilled tofu that we love. Do not care if you bring only your light body. Would just be so happy to sit at the table and talk about the menu. Miss you. Wish we could bet which chilies they'll put on the cubes of tofu, our favorite. Sometimes green, sometimes red, roasted, we always thought, but so cold and fresh. How did they do it? Wish you could be here to talk about it like it was so important. Wish you could. Watched you on the screens as I was walking, as I was cooking. Wished you could get out of the hospital. Can't bring myself to order our dish and eat it in the car. Miss you laughing. Miss you coming in from the cold or one too many meetings. Laughing. I'll order already. I'll order 7 helpings, some dumplings, and those cold yam noodles that you like. You can come in your light body or skeleton or be invisible. I don't even care. No, you have a long way to travel. No, I don't even know if it's long at all. Wish you could tell me what you're reading, if you're reading. Miss you. I'm at the table in the back. Food is such a, I don't know. Sue, what is food for you?
Thank you for asking that question, because food is everything to me. That's why I was so excited by this poem. I feel like food is my persona. It doesn't matter if it's like I'm with just one other person or with 5 people. I just want to order everything and just like, and be in abundance together and just eat till like everyone wants to just sleep. And so reading this poem and hearing you read it, it's just, I wonder if you have the same approach or like, yeah, what is food for you?
Food is everything for me. I mean, like, almost to my detriment, but no, like, it's just, I love to cook. My partner, Angeline, is an astonishing cook. And so that's part of our language. I grew up with my grandparents who loved to cook. There was always, and like to make, like bone broths and stuff. So there was always that smell in the house that was like almost terrible, but also so delicious, of like,
yeah, you know what's coming.
Yeah.
You know something good is coming.
Like marrow, just like, and all night long, cook all night long, the stuff. And then I think for me, a big kind of freedom once I moved away from like a small rural place was like moving to a place like New York. And all of a sudden there was so much food, like to have gone from like not very good, although I loved it, Chinese American food in East Hampton, Connecticut, to like all of a sudden going to Sarah Lawrence College and like going to Chinatown and like roaming around and eating, like, I mean, dumplings are a big thing for me. They're just like, I can't even explain. And so eating different kinds of animals, just like the freedom of that, and then doing that with people. I mean, I think one of the first ways I really felt adult was making food with people, like making, pasta for people, making lasagna, making Greek food, and then doing stuff like going to dim sum. That has been something through the pandemic that has been really hard for me. I mean, these are first world problems for sure. But going to dim sum on the weekends was a big deal to me. And I've yet to have that thing where there's like 10, 12 people at a table and you're like sucking on chicken feet and like eating a dumpling and just like it's too spicy for my little Puritan soul. But like, I don't care. Like, I'm going to suffer later. And I just like, like the bounty, the pleasure of big, going to an Italian restaurant and getting a ton of pasta. And I miss that a lot. And it also just taught me about the world, like so much of what I know about other people has to do with what they love to eat.
Now I'm very distracted, just thinking about all the food you listed.
If we were just like somewhere where we could all go right now and just like sit outside and eat Sue, what would our meal be right now? Where would we go? Anywhere in the planet.
I just want pan-fried dumplings.
Oh,
honestly, and not
yes.
from a frozen bag, and
No.
not my mom's because hers is too healthy.
Yes.
I just want like trashy, greasy pan-fried dumplings. I love them scalding hot. For me, food is about texture too. I'm a texture person.
Yeah.
So I don't say I want dessert. I say I need a crunchy dessert or I need a smooth dessert. So I love eating things like just like raw off the heat and burning the roof of my mouth. That's how I know I'm pretty happy today. And I'll remember it tomorrow. Oh gosh, sorry, we're like so away from the poem. I can't even, all I remember is the 7 helpings from the poem.
I feel like we're right in the poem though, because I feel like this is what these poems hope to do, and this is I think what ghosts and food and this time does, which is like, we're maybe not like in a certain part of the poetics of the poem, but you kind of just walked into the restaurant where I'm waiting for Jenny, which is a little bit what I hope that the poem will do. I'm really inspired by people like C.A. Conrad and the remarkable poet Destiny Hempel, holy moly, and Juan Nguyen. Like poets where it's not a joke about like the poem makes something happen. And it's not just like, you know what I mean? Not just something intellectual, although intellectual things actually absolutely happen, but that there's a kind of somatic practice with the poem where it all of a sudden we're in the room together, we're eating and the dumplings are steaming. And I think this is another aspect of when I was trying to figure out these poems, and I'm still trying to figure them out. Like, could the act of saying miss you over and over again, and not I miss you, but like miss you, which is like a real action, and then talking about the food and also talking about the body, and also like you can leave your body behind. Like, I don't care. I'd take any incarnation of you. Could in like building and building that, almost everyone who's listening to it also come in, and it doesn't really matter at that point if where we are is the world of the living or not, if that makes sense. Like maybe we're in the ghost restaurant. Maybe I'm not alive anymore by the end of the poem, and I've gone to see Jenny, and we've all come to see Jenny at Shanghai Dumpling on Franklin Street in Chapel Hill. Maybe I've been able to bring her back from the dead, or my grandmother back from the other side, and they're with us. But maybe there's something about just like building a space where it almost doesn't even matter because the gate is just open and everyone gets to be who they are. And poems can do that. I'm sure there's fiction writers listening. Well, I don't know if anyone's listening anymore, but like I think fiction and nonfiction, I think, can do that in certain ways. But I do think poems can do that. I mean, I do think that's the place where like poetry, spell work, magic, prayer, kind of all comes, daydream comes together, where it's like you can make that space in a poem. You can make the portal.
I feel like that's why I'm so drawn to these miss you poems, is that I feel plopped down somewhere and I'm like, oh, here I am. Let's see what happens.
Yeah, there we are all together.
I'm really curious about the body. In these miss you poems, the bodies are ephemeral and concrete. Like they hold just so many. What you said was, you don't care what incarnation this person is as long as they show up in one way, shape, or form. And so I really want to turn to the poem, My Perimenopausal Body Cistern, Disappointing, How Surprising. Because I feel like there, the body is inescapable, but through the poem, it is escapable. And I would love it if you could read it for us.
Sure. This one I'm scared to read, but I'm really excited to have it in poetry. I thank you all for having it. My perimenopausal body cistern, disappointing, how surprising. Bled all day, stopped bleeding, bled some more. Went to the doctor who reached inside the woman body I try to live with, make peace with, but also ignore. Sad tenant, my uterus. One day the tenant turns out to be the landlord. All day I wonder what it means, a clock I know as well as I know anything, but also never wanted, and also won't give up. In the history of my light body, it will show I could have been another. The shots, the surgeon's blade, that freedom. But I hold on, not out of fear, well maybe, but also this body I fought for. Timid skin sack that grew into a kind of magnificence I'd not expected. I tie my bow tie around my neck that's not quite the neck I want, but still, The neck survived hours on the floor, begging for my life, bent head crying in the bathroom, bent head walking by the boys yelling hog and dog and ugly as an animal. It's confusing. I protect the breasts that I live without in my mind's eye. I look for hours at men's trousers and kimonos and bleed all day. My mind says, take it out, and though it's one step closer to the one true self I wanted, also I miss it in ways I can't explain. Burnt off scroll, I'm a mirror of a mirror. When I was 8 at daycare, my friends pulled me aside to talk about a sex change. All of us in our Catholic uniforms, Meg, Emily, Nadine, and Brian, who got kicked out because of me. That's later in the story. We drew me in the sand. We planned and wondered how much it cost to be another body. But now, I know my body. I pull up my pants and feel the lack of one thing as the muffin top reminds me of the persistence of another. Me, who's with me always. This pillow that looked over me, pillow of skin and fat that I'd call Rubenesque. It tried its best to cover me, so I worry over it. Strange companion, this body that covers me and bleeds all day without ceasing. I say, come on. I say, stop. Like I used to when I'd get too scared of one thing or another. God comes back to find me in the most confounding ways. Me and my body, who are often not the same. Who knew I'd get older and end up in perimenopause?
I don't know.
Yeah, nobody knew. Nobody told me.
There's so much tenderness and there's so much frustration with the body. And I love the last line, me and my body, who are often not the same. And I love that separation and that distance. But surprisingly, if you read that line another way, it means you are the same sometimes.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering if you could just talk about the tension there a little more, or, how you had the courage to write such a vulnerable poem.
Yeah, I mean, I'm writing these poems about this period that I am in my life, no pun intended, and it's really hard. And when I give readings and I've read this poem, there's a lot of people who write to me afterwards, so it's one of the reasons that I also am publishing it and grateful to be publishing it. And it's really intense, like being in a body that one has imagined as masculine their whole life, has a real, like, profound, I mean, fantasy isn't the right word. I have another body that I envision for myself, and also, like, is often genderless. To then, like, have the body start this process where, like, my biology cannot be denied right now. And I'm someone who takes good care of myself, but I have never been someone who thought about my biology in that way, in my fantasy life or not. And at the same time, and this actually happened also when I had a breast cancer scare a few years ago, and there was this moment where I realized I had always imagined myself in a way, like there's a version of me that does not have breasts, that has pecs, that is, beautifully tapered into a V, their waistline. I mean, I've written poems about it. When all of a sudden there was this moment where, like, I might lose a breast or lose my breasts, like I really didn't want to do that. And it had nothing to do, really, to me, it had nothing to do with my gender. It had to do with, like, this body had been through a tremendous amount, and it had been through a lot of harm, and it had really kept itself alive, if that makes sense, and that I do feel a tremendous tenderness towards it. It has protected me, and I have protected it. And I also just want to pause and say, this poem is really, I mean, it is me really trying to work through something about myself. And there may also be people who really read this poem and are like, this is not my experience, and have, maybe really negative feelings about this poem. And I would say, please be in touch, because it's something I'm really trying to figure out. And, but for me, that kind of tenderness and that kind of loyalty to a body that has sheltered me, but that I also like kind of don't visualize as my body, if that makes sense, is really intense for me. And being at a place in my life where it's not like even that I have to think about it all the time. It's like literally that just for 10 days out of the month, it is relentlessly present with me, has really been very difficult for me. And I am trying to be tender with myself, and I'm trying to put that tenderness in my poems. I'm also frankly just trying to also talk about something in these poems that I have not read a lot of talk about. There are people who do it, but I would go searching around for like, well, what happens like when you are in perimenopause and you are a masculine presenting non-binary like vessel? What do you do about that? So this is a space for me trying to figure that out.
Yeah, what have you learned what to do?
I mean, I think that one thing I've learned is, and this is probably maybe in some way my poetics have taught me this. I will say also like a poet like Oliver Bayes-Bendorf, who's one of my great friends, and I think just one of the great poets of thinking about the body and dream and all of this. I was just texting with Oliver today about how freaked out I am about this poem. I think I have learned a kind of patience in my poetics and with myself. I do think that just in general, the work of the last 10 years of my life as a poet have been, and it's not surprising it came up after a breakdown, was not being so certain all the time, or being okay with not being so certain. And that like uncertainty and fallibility and the willingness to be wrong and the willingness to be open and also for change to happen is an energy that I really try and have in my poems, and is also something I'm really learning in my life. I mean, I'm just riding this thing, and I'm also in poems sort of riding like, what is the experience of being able to own something without knowing it and making the reader know it. And that I think is true for me. I don't know, you've probably had experiences like this, right? Like for me personally, with my mom taking her life and being as scared as I was in my house growing up, there was a real period like in my poems, when I was writing my poems, like I owned that experience. I had lived through it. Like it was mine. And I wanted the reader to understand the poem the way I wanted it understood, because it was a kind of loyalty. And at some point, like I stopped, it's not good or bad, but that stopped being for something that I looked for in my poems. I became more comfortable also in my body of not needing definition to be something that was as important to me. And I think this poem is about that too, which is like, wow, this is so weird. Okay, like let's work through it.
There's definitely a modeling of process, like how I feel like this poem teaches any reader how to take care of yourself and how to be curious about your body and how to be okay with not being sure or ever being sure. And I love when you were talking, you're describing as you had to like learn it, it took time, and something that's literally time driven in your body, in biology. And you describe your parts as like landlord, tenant, right? These like capitalism words and just like the constraint that it has. But the poem refuses to kind of give in, but you just like persist on that pushing of going back and forth. And I think everyone could use that.
Wow, what a reader you are. I mean, just like what a friggin' awesome, lucky being I am. And I will say, like, I want to talk just for a moment, like, and this is a poem that keeps teaching me things like the term sex change was one that was really, I mean, that is true to the time. That was in the 80s. It was absolutely, that was the word that was used. It was the way I envisioned it. That moment absolutely happened. Like my friends were like very seriously come over, and we went into the corner of the playground and we tried to figure out how much a sex change. But like this is a way poems can evolve and teach you. It would not have been appropriate for this poem to have transition. Any kind of modern term for this would not have worked in the poem. But it also made me uncomfortable to have the term sex change in the poem in a way. And you helped me, even something that seems small, like, well, let's put quotes around it. Like, I think that's a way the poem teaches me how to be true to the past, also aware of the present, also to acknowledge my own discomfort that I have, and also acknowledging like, but I need to keep that phrase in there. I understand. I think there are people who may read this poem and get really upset by that phrase. It's an upsetting phrase, but I also think it's important to have that in the poem. And that's a way a poem can teach me, like the process of like, okay, like what discomfort are you willing to sit in the poem? how are you willing to learn in the poem? And I learned so much through our editorial process. I was so grateful.
Just hearing you talk, I've been meditating on this idea of, when we write a poem, it's so easy to be honest because you can be honest while not being truthful.
Totally.
Like, we can say things that are lies and are truths, whatever that is, and it's still, I consider it poetic honesty. And I was trying to explain that to my students. I was like, what's a lie you've told about yourself? What are the lies you tell your loved ones? And think about why you do it. And I feel like that's when ourselves become so honest.
Totally.
And so relatable.
Yeah. And like, I mean, I was so lucky. Gosh, this is a ghost conversation. My tremendous teacher, Lucy Bruck Barreto, she would always say, I always want you to tell me the truth, especially when you're lying to me. I mean, that was what she always used to say about poems. And she is that. I mean, if you go on the Poetry Foundation site and you like look at her poems, I mean, she was that. It did not, truthfulness was incredibly important to her as a tone and as like a point of authority, but lying was also really important, or like the acknowledgement that we are lying a lot of the time. And how can you do that? Like, how can you do that in a way that is true and honest?
Mm-hmm. Gosh. Now I'm thinking of all the lies I told this week.
Yeah. I mean, to oneself and to others. Like, even when I had, the second piece of quiche, I told myself a lie to get to do that. Oh, I need another piece. I'm doing a podcast. That's going to take a certain kind of energy.
Oh, I'm glad you had that second slice. And it's okay if you had a third and you're not telling us. Yeah. Oh, gosh. Yeah, I feel like with each of these poems, the voice is just leading us through another door. And we're like in another room, and we don't quite know that we've changed spaces. You said, the Miss You poems are a part of a larger series, it sounds like. And I'm so curious, where do you imagine yourself, the reader, ending up at the end of these Miss You poems? Where would you like us to be?
I think I would like to be in like the Ghost Kingdom Jamboree together. Like there's this film Longtime Companion that I think about a lot. Because I also think that for myself and my generation of queer people, I just think it's not conceivable that the AIDS epidemic wasn't a huge part of our experience also of COVID. And there's this film Longtime Companion. It's about a group of friends in the middle of the height of the AIDS crisis and the American AIDS crisis. The height of the AIDS crisis continues all over the world. There are things about it that are pretty problematic. Like when we look at it now in hindsight, there's very few people of color in that movie. But there's this amazing last scene where Mary Louise Parker, she and this actor, who are kind of in some ways like the last people who've survived in a certain kind of way of this friend group, they're in Fire Island. They're sort of standing on the beach and like, they're like, can you imagine when this is over? Like, can you even imagine when this is over? Mm. And the person's just like, I can't remember what they say, but essentially like, it's going to be amazing. Like, it's going to be so beautiful. And all of a sudden this music starts playing and you start to see like all these people, these men on the beach, like a party. It's like they've crested in Fire Island and there's this, as usual, like a kind of party going on. But then what you start to see is that the party is full of people who are alive and also full of the dead. Like all these characters in the movie who've died are also like hugging and dancing and everyone's like, like so happy to see each other. And it's not heaven, like it's Fire Island. Like it's like, which is maybe heaven, but like it's Fire Island and everyone just gets to be there dead and alive together. Like everyone's just together again. It's not about like, oh, now we're in heaven. Now it's like, no, I just want to fucking be together again. I remember I saw that movie in the mid-90s. I remember even then that scene was so moving to me. I'm sure there's so many film critics who were like, oh, it's so sentimental. It's so maudlin. But it's true. Like, it's like, and I will say like the poems think about that scene a lot. Like that thing of like, what if it's not about like the aspiration of heaven, or it's not that, it's just like at the end of the poem somehow like something has been conjured where everyone is just together in whatever vessel they're in. Like you don't have to make excuses for yourself that you're dead anymore. You don't have to apologize that my grandmother doesn't have to apologize that after like 3 days on life support she laughed. and she died, and like, I don't have to apologize for still being alive, and my mother can show up, and everyone is just there together. And it's a kind of community that isn't based on paradise, or aspiration. And it doesn't matter like how you showed up. I think that's what the poems would like to do. Small goal, open all the gates of reality and let everyone be there together, no biggie. But a feeling like that, a feeling like we're all feasting. The door of the house is open. Everyone gets to come in through whatever gate they come through. And like, I'm just going to keep turning to them, like handing them plates of stuff. And we're all going to like eat. We're too happy to even like think about the fact that maybe some of us are alive and maybe some of us aren't. I spend a lot of time thinking about the people in my life who've died and how they died and why they died and what could have changed, and missing them in that way and feeling angry and feeling sad and justifiably, like, with my mom, thinking about poverty and mental illness and Reagan era economics and all that. But like, maybe there's a moment where we can be just happy and we get to see each other, and we're just in this kind of ghostly presence together.
A big thank you to Gabrielle Cavalcaresi. Cavalcaresi is the author of 3 books of poetry, including Rocket Fantastic, winner of the Audre Lorde Award for Lesbian Poetry. You can read the poems you heard today in the October 2021 issue of Poetry, in print and online. If you're not yet a subscriber to the magazine, there's a special rate for podcast listeners. For a limited time, you can get a full year of the magazine for $20. That's 11 book-length issues for just $20. Visit poetrymagazine.org/podcast offer to subscribe. That's poetrymagazine.org/podcast offer. This show is produced by Rachel James. The music in this episode came from Reservoir, Alabaster de Plume, John McCowan, Rob Mazurek, and Irreversible Entanglements. Okay, that's it. Until next time, be well, stay safe, and thanks for listening.